another Matryoshka doll. I made that same reference last week, so don't get mad at me. I only have so many idioms to make here. But another episode in an episode today, which is very exciting. We have our second open mic episode here of the season, which is the podcast where we talk about albums that came out recently. And today I am joined by the production coordinator here at CFMU, Jamie, as well as one of our music committee volunteers, Noor. So welcome to open mic, as well as on that note, guys. Do you guys want to share? So I picked out the album that the song we just heard was from, which is Waiting Game by Junior Boys. And do you guys want to share the albums that you guys chose today?
Yeah, so I chose Blue Rev by Alvvays.
Nice.
And I chose Changes by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
Nice. This is very exciting. Two fun, actually a lot of fun albums to talk about today. Very synth heavy today, which I'm enjoying. So we'll start with Waiting Game. It is the first release from the Hamilton duo Junior Boys in 6 years, so it's pretty long awaited. I hadn't listened to any of their discography prior to this one, but I did get a quick chance to listen to one of their prior songs. And this newer album is quite different from a lot of their past releases, which is pretty interesting. It's a really kind of droning, ambient, dreamy, almost jazzy electronic music, which is pretty fun. Listening to their past releases, it's kind of more like indie alternative vibe at points. So, pretty fun variety here. I gave it my first top to bottom listen while I was working on a project this morning, and there's like something very magical about the fact that I was able to like sit down and focus for like 30 minutes while it was on, which was pretty fun. And I think I attribute that to the general ambientness of it, which I liked. In terms of like kind of the vibe that I get from it, I've seen a few comparisons to Caribou, who's also Canadian kind of synthy dream pop, as well as Boards of Canada, who are British, which I think is pretty apt comparison. What were your guys' thoughts, just generally, I guess?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I really liked a few of the songs. They were more interesting beats, like the one song was like Samba on Samba. Like I was listening to it also like while I was doing work, because I like to listen to like ambient chiller things, because I'm just like focused, just like it just clicks your brain on.
Yeah.
And then during some of them I was like, oh, this is like kind of dancey, like it's at the same makes you want to chill, but it's still like so I like those songs.
Yeah, definitely. And I just thought of going back to what you were saying about how you can sit down and just sort of focus while you're listening to this album. Definitely what I was thinking while I was listening, and I was listening to the song Fidget, and it sort of had this like percussion-y sort of vibe going on, and you kind of always you felt like you had this sort of urgency that sort of resolves at the end of the song, but very abruptly. So it kind of had those different vibes that remind me of classical music sometimes in a sense.
Oh, that's a fun comparison.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely some parts, like especially with like electronic kind of ambient, that tie in quite a lot to like classical song structure, which I think is really fun. I find the mention of percussion from, I think, both of you quite interesting, because when I was listening, I was like, there seems almost like a lack of percussion throughout, which I think was still kind of made up for in just like the general synthiness and structure of each of the songs, which I thought was pretty interesting, because they still had that like drive without necessarily drum sounds, I guess.
I think then when the percussion does show up, that's why we both noticed it, because then you actually notice it. It's not like it's always there. It's only present in a song when it's like needed. They don't add percussion to a track regardless. It's like, no, this song, the percussion is the main point, so we're going to use it. Like it is vital. Yeah. So
I think that makes it like stand out a lot more too when it's used more sparsely, but then it kind of, when it is there, it's definitely notable in the grand scheme of the album as a whole.
Feels more like purposeful.
Yeah, exactly.
And even when they do add it, it's not super typical, like the typical percussion that you'd hear in regular pop rock songs. So it's still kind of adds a different taste to the songs.
Yeah. Something I actually brought up in last week's episode was I discussed a little bit on mine and the guests' opinions on what like a perfect album length is. And I think this one falls in my golden range.
Wait, how long is?
It's 9 songs and 36 minutes, which I think is like pretty spot on for at least my attention span, maybe it's just by virtue of watching too many like TikToks in my lifetime. But I think it's a really nice length. I think it's listenable, which I appreciate a lot. And I think that's actually pretty consistent for all of the albums we looked at today. Is there like, even the Alvvays one had 14 songs, I think, but it was still only
like 30 something, 36 minutes. Yeah,
which is, it's nice. I don't know. Maybe it is just my attention span, but I thought it was a good length.
I like being able to like listen to an album and then you're done. Like you don't get interrupted by other things. It's not like an hour plus. I feel like 30, 45 minutes. It's like really good albums are always within that range, I find.
Yep. I think it definitely also improves like the top to bottom kind of listenability of an album. It's like digestible, if that makes sense.
Yep.
In terms of the particular tracks, there was a few things that I thought were kind of fun. In the track Dumb Audio, I actually had to Google this one, so credit to Pitchfork for their review that let me know that the vocals in this track in particular are actually sung in Latin.
Really? Wow.
It's a little hard to tell because of all like the vocal effects and kind of things put on over the vocals, but interesting. It's pretty cool. I probably wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't read that.
I personally didn't notice, so
me neither.
Yeah, I think it's just by virtue of the vocal effects, which I've grown quite fond of. After giving it a few listens, I think the more I kind of listened to it, the more that it grew on me. Yes 2 was another favorite track of mine. It kind of got into like the jazzier territory of the dreamy ambient sound, which I really like personally. Which I think overall it's like quite impressionistic in its production. Like we mentioned, little percussion and heavy synths, but somehow it all comes together really nicely, which I really liked.
Yeah.
And I think, after listening to this, I'm definitely going to check out more of their discography, because after reading that it was so vastly different, now I'm very intrigued, and also local, so pretty sick.
Yeah.
I like this one. One more note that I wrote down, which I think we kind of already touched on, but I think I had written that I think there's just enough melody throughout the record to kind of keep it grounded. Which is something I don't listen to a whole lot of ambient, so it's something that I kind of value in terms of like listenability. But it's like in the track that I played at the beginning of the episode, Thinking About You Calms Me Down, there's like just enough melody, I think, that it kind of keeps the song moving, but it still has that like dreamy sounds, which I really like. And I think it's pretty consistent throughout the album. Moving on, I think that's a fun one. We have another Canadian band, another Canadian album that I've been listening to pretty often since it first came out. Another pretty highly awaited one. It's the third album from Canada's Alvvays.
Yeah, so they released this album after 5 years. Their last album was in 2017. And I was reading up on the process of them making this album, and they had a recorder full of demos stolen.
Yeah.
They had their basement flood with their gear.
Like the next day after they got robbed. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then with the whole pandemic, the borders closing, they couldn't rehearse. So it's kind of like a long-awaited album for a lot of Alvvays fans. And for me particularly, I was really excited when I saw that they released a new album. And it sort of has like a pop rock feel, sort of similar to some of their older albums. But I also kind of got a hint of like 80s rock kind of style throughout the album as well. So I really appreciated that as well.
I actually read, like, just tying into the kind of production of it, that once they finally were able to get into a studio and record it, it was like full top to bottom, like the whole album, maybe like 30 seconds between songs, but they just like banged it out, which is always impressive to hear when like a band can mesh well enough together just to like completely record something like that. I think it's really fun. Another one of my personal favorite tidbits about this album is that it's titled after the caffeinated alcoholic beverage Rev, which is pretty popular on the East Coast, where I and also Molly Rankin, the like lead singer, are from, which I just thought was fun. I think it's the East Coast thing. I didn't realize that they were actually like from PEI, which is pretty cool. But they're Toronto based now. You mentioned their past records and how you like them. I thought that that Blue Rev was honestly kind of like a combination almost of like their self-titled debut and Antisocialites, which are two albums that I'm a really big fan of. So they kind of almost meshed together in this
That's what I thought too, yeah. I just thought it was a representation of them overall. And the fact that they recorded a top to bottom all at once and yet still sounds so amazing is just crazy. I really appreciated that in the album.
It definitely speaks to like the band as a whole, I think.
Yeah.
And just how they work together. It's really fun. I find that even when I listen to Alvvays in general, that oftentimes their production kind of can overshadow like the lyricism to some extent, which isn't negative inherently, but a lot of the songs are just like they have that contrast between being really loud and then like really quiet, which I think they do really well. But I think sometimes it like leads me to kind of focus away from the lyrics, which the lyrics in this album are actually really good. Like going in and kind of reading into them a little more, they're pretty fun. You said you listen to it a lot. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite track from it? Can you name one?
Yeah, so I have two. After the Earthquake and Tile by Tile, sorry. So the reason I liked After the Earthquake is because it's sort of like a softer guitar, more clean, as a contrast from the song before it, which was Easy on Your Own. And I just really liked that sort of contrast. And then it's just Molly's voice was just so perfect. It sort of added on to that energy of the song. And the song was actually about a breakup, but and you mentioned that the voice sort of gets,
almost lost.
By the
like,
instruments, and I just reading up on the lyrics, it was just really nice to see what the actual song was about as well.
I actually read that the After the Earthquake, that one is inspired by a Haruki Murakami like short story collection called After the Quake, which I haven't read. I've heard of the author, but pretty interesting just to see the different influences.
Yeah, and you said earlier that it reminded you of like 80s sound. I got that a lot. Like it sounded very like dream poppy, and like usually in that type of music the vocals are totally obscured. Like it's just so overpowered by the effects and the production just to make that like soundscape that I was pleasantly surprised when I heard that this was going to be dreamy, and I listened to it and the vocals were still cutting through, but not in like a bad way. Like it still had that obscured dreamy feel and driving feel to the song. Like the vocals didn't take away from it, but they were able to add that like clear layer while still preserving the feeling. I think Alvvays does that really well in like having that kind of over the top production at times, but then the vocals are still present. There's one song in particular that I think really kind of helps with that. I really like the track Very Online Guy. It's like really stylistic, but at the same time, like reading the lyrics, they're kind of about, social media and today and how it affects people growing up, which I think is kind of that fun contrast almost between having that really stylized song, but the message is still there, which I think is really, really fun.
Yeah. That song in particular reminded me of the song Take On Me with the synth going on. So I just thought that was a pretty cool homage to that song as well.
That's definitely a good comparison. Which also kind of ties in the track Belinda Says. I was reading up on that one, and it's actually like, at least the title itself is inspired by Belinda Carlisle from the Go-Go's. So definitely a big 60s, 70s, 80s sort of influence in the record as a whole, which I really like. I think it's definitely lived up to kind of the rest of Alvvays' discography, in my opinion.
I was saying, I also really like the track Bored in Bristol, which reminded me of the 70s and 80s, but in a different way. It reminded me, like, I don't know if you know those, like, cheap Casio synths that were, like, mass-produced at the time. Sometimes they'd have, like, loops, you'd, like, play it, and it'd be, like, this, like, crunchy, like, synth little, but in, like, the best way possible. Like, when I say, like, a cheap keyboard and crunchy, I mean, like, really good. Like, I love that sound. And that's what this song sounded like to me. Like, it was just on one of those keyboards without sounding like it was on those keyboards, but it still gave that same kind of like feeling and that tonality that was like I personally really love, and I think it's very satisfying to listen to.
I agree. I think satisfying is honestly a really good way to put it with like songs like these where there's just so many layers and so many filters and things that once it all comes together, it tickles your brain in such a good way that I really like. Overall, I've been a big fan of this album since it came out, and it's always fun to chat about. And we have just enough time now to move on to our third album, which is Changes by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.
Yeah.
I have a confession. This was the first top to bottom listen of a King Gizzard album that I've ever done, which I just haven't. They have such a huge discography that it's kind of daunting, I think, when you haven't kind of gotten into it already.
Like, even this album, it was their third one in October. Yeah. In the 1 month, that was the third one. End of the year, it's their fifth one of the year.
That's
crazy.
Impressive.
Yeah.
I think they have like 23 proper studio albums and like 17 other miscellaneous demos and stuff. And they've only been together for like maybe 10 years, I want to say.
That's impressive.
Yeah,
that is really impressive.
And they had done 5 albums in 2017 as well. And people were like, wow, that's nuts. They can never do that again. And at the beginning of this year, they were like, oh, we're going to put out 5 albums this year. And people were like, no way. No, you're not. And they did. They just made it with, this album being the 5th one.
Yeah, I remember I added one of their earlier October albums, the Ice Death Planets, that one.
The bunch of nouns,
Yeah, a lot of nouns. And then I think like a week later, I had an email from another promoter, and I was like, well, there's more.
Yeah.
Which I think it's impressive when a group are able to do that and have still like consistent sound-ish and still have like a consistent fan base as well.
Yeah. I think how they're able to do that is a lot of the albums are like strong concepts. Like this one, the kind of concept is the first song almost acts like a theme. So the first song is like this 15-minute like song that's just like a normal song, but the rest of them are all based on just 2 chords. So the rest of the songs are just 2 chord progressions, and they take from each different section of the opening chord, or the opening song, So then all the following songs are like the other song delved into further into each of the sections. And it's amazing how just with like 2 chords, they have some songs that are like 8 minutes, and it doesn't get boring. Like it's still like it doesn't sound like it's just 2 chords. It's very complex and fun and jammy. And another fun fact is the song names actually spell out changes. Like the first letter of each of the songs spell out the album name, which is like kind of cheesy, but I like that. And some of the songs on here are like cheesy, but I like that.
I get it. There was something you mentioned. The first one being 15 minutes-ish. I'm a big sucker for a long song, and I do remember when I was like reading up on the album, reading the whole like based off of 2 chords thing, and I was like, no way. You listen to the songs and it doesn't feel like they're only playing two chords, really, which I think is really cool that you're able to kind of build a song around that, for sure.
What I think is interesting also is this album has kind of like a jazzy feel to it. It's also like synthy prog, but I feel like the jazz element's the strongest, and it really reminds me of like, they did an album with Mild High Club about 5 years ago, and I was like, this sounds just like an extension of that album, but like stronger and a lot better produced. And I guess like one of the songs, or a few of them, have actually been around since 2017. So a lot of them are just ideas they had floating, and then they just like worked it into the 2 chord thing and jammed it a lot. And then
nice.
I think as a band, they just like throw everything they can find at the wall, hoping that it'll stick, and then they just put it out. That's why they put out so much. They don't like worry about perfecting things. So there are misses, but I don't think this is one of them.
I definitely, once again, huge discography that I've been a little daunted by, but listening to this one, definitely, I want to get more in there, because I did really, really enjoy it. I'm a real sucker for when songs in an album transition perfectly into one another, too, which it really got me in this one. It really did. Yeah,
that's a big King Gizzard thing. Like, to listen to one of their albums on shuffle is kind of seen as like sacrilege by the diehard King Gizzard fans, because it's so intentional. They even have a lot of albums that the last song loops to the first one. So if you're listening on digital, it's seamless the entire time. Wow.
Nice.
So I'm pretty sure all of their albums, they have like, the transition is just like perfect.
Nice.
And, I'm also such a sucker for that. I can just like sit there.
It really gets me. It really does.
Yeah.
I just love when you don't even notice that it's like the next song. I was like listening to it, and I just checked my phone because I was like, oh, I like this one. I was like, what? It's a new one. Which I think is fun.
Yeah.
I had written down that there's something almost kind of retro sounding, but also proggy at the same time and like progressive, which I think is pretty fun to kind of blend all those together.
It kind of reminds me of, like, I don't know if you know Gentle Giant, like synth prog giant from the like 70s. It reminds me a lot of that, and also some of the melodies remind me of like Susie and the Banshees, kind of. Like the voicing of a lot of the synths and the actual like sounds of the synths, I think, are very reminiscent of like the 80s and that. But then the way they incorporate like the jazz and the jam aspect and polyrhythms and stuff kind of makes it feel modern. So it doesn't feel like it's from back then, but it still has that classic feel to it.
Which is like fun to kind of combine sort of older sounds with also more modern influences and like progression in music, which I think is really fun. Another track that I had written down was AstroTurf, which I added a subnote that says, this might be because I'm a biology student and I really like lyrics that are about bugs, but also just a fun song. Once again, sucker for long songs. It's like 7.5 minutes, but it doesn't feel like it, which is nice.
I had written down that I like to hate dancing because it's just sort of you have the chords in the background that are sort of grounding the song, but then you have all the synth and everything in the foreground, and the vocals it just sort of really complements everything, the whole song.
That one's so fun. And like I'm kind of a diehard King Gizzard fan, and when I heard that song, that was the first one they released off this album, I didn't like it. I was like, what is this? I'm like, this is so cheesy. What are they doing? And then like I kept listening to it and I'm like, I love this song. At first I was just baffled. I'm like, this is a miss. This is gonna be so bad. And like the third time I heard it, I'm like, this is the catchiest song I've heard in so long. And
I almost love that when an album kind of it can grow on you. Like some of them almost need more than one listen to just kind of get the full picture. You almost need to like pick it apart almost layer by layer, which I really love. I think it improves just the listenability of an album for me when I can almost analyze it, if that makes sense.
And I think because King Gizzard are all over the place, like, you know, a few years back they put out a thrash metal album, then they had like a microtonal hard rock album and then a jazz album, and like they're all over the place. Everything I hear from a new album, I'm always like, no, I don't like this new direction. Like they should go back to one of the others, and then they like make it work really well. So
which I think is
kudos to them.
It's something really impressive for an artist to be able to have that much variety and both maintain such a die-hard fan base as well as to be able to still succeed in each of these different genres is really, like, that's hard.
And they somehow always sound like King Gizzard. Like they put out like a Beastie Boys-esque song last year on this album, and you could still tell it was King Gizzard, even though it was like them rapping and like it literally sounded like the Beastie Boys, but you could still tell like, this is Gizzard, this is them for sure.
And I think that ties into it, is just having kind of a strong identity as a musical group, but then being able to kind of delve into different genres and still maintain that identity is something I don't think a lot of groups can do. But when it's done, it's impressive. It's very impressive. Which I think that seems to be a trend throughout this episode, is just this kind of fun variety of combination of retro and jazzy and a lot of synth and layers and stuff in each of these albums, which I think is what gives them all kind of a fun listenability, is, like I mentioned, that kind of need to pick things apart. I think each of the albums we brought today are ones that you can do that. They have a very, like a multiple listen kind of potential, which I think is nice.
Yeah, definitely.
That brings us to almost a full half hour, which is always impressive as to how much it's how easy it is just to kind of talk about music. Which I think is that's the moral of the story. My other moral of the story that I wrote was that I owe King Gizzard more listens now after having liked this album, which also is what I will transition us out of. I had picked the track, I think Gandhi to kind of clue us up today. But thank you guys for joining me on this episode of Open Mic. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely.
And thank you also to anyone for listening. And to kind of transition us out of this once again, we have the track Gandhi?
I'm not sure. No idea.
Fair enough. From the new Changes by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard.